Okay, so things to come. On Wednesday, after your quiz and we finish lymphatic system, we'll start on reproductive system. So we will have Wednesday, Friday, and Monday over reproductive system. I will finish it. So even if you guys have an at-home lecture, we will finish reproductive system. This is my missionary work to the world. Reproductive system, right? Yeah. It's the kind that I believe in. Okay, so, and then next Wednesday, which is what date? 7th, will be your 4th test. Yes? And that test should cover vessels, vessels, urinary, lymphatic, reproductive. Yeah? Okay, which means that you do, of course, on this last test have a lab practical and a lecture test in the same week. Okay? Your lab practical is worth less than 10% of your total grade. I just want you to remember that as you start to, right? Because it's half of 20% of your total grade. So, but you don't get to drop it, so make sure that you use your time wisely. Don't get yourself at the last minute and not have any time to study for your lecture test. And then next, the Monday after that, right? So okay, so let's do it this way. December, what's next week? 7th. Wednesday, December 7th, test 4. And then Friday, December 9th, that's reading day. There are no classes that day, but I will be on Redwood campus. Hours TBD, I think probably 10 to 2 or 10 to 3, if I can get somebody to pick up my kids. I will be there for the last time with all of your tests. It's the last time you can see any of your tests in the last office hours that I have for the semester, and it's at Redwood campus. Okay, I'll tell you where a little bit later. It'll be posted. Your 4th test will be there. You can look over and take notes on the multiple choice part, but you won't have your final grade or the short answer part graded yet. You'll just be able to look over the multiple choice. Make sense? And then Monday, December, what's that? 14th? 12th. Oh, December 12th. At 1:30 to 3:30. And that is for this 1 o'clock class only. That's your final. I think that's the last thing you need to know. Your grades will be posted no later than, they have to be posted by the next Tuesday, so the 20th is the latest that your grades would be posted. However, I like my break to start as soon as possible, so I will get them done very quickly. Your final is all multiple choice. They have to be graded. All 250 of my students, all of their grades have to be in less than a week. And the last of my students take their final on Thursdays. So they have to be done really quickly. So, and there are no bonus questions on the final. It's just whatever you get. Go ahead.
Do you use the same previous questions?
Some of them. About 60% of the questions are off of old tests, and the other 40% are material that should be familiar to you, but questions you haven't seen before. Good? And what am I forgetting to tell you? What do you want to know? Anything?
So what's the room again for the reading day?
I don't know yet. It'll be posted when I figure out where I can keep you guys. Kind of depends on how many people. It's somewhere right around my office on the Redwood campus in the SI building. SI 3 something, the 3rd floor. Everybody okay with that? Okay. What else do you need to know?
Do you
Anything?
know where finals going to be?
Here. Finals here.
In this room?
Yeah. Finals here. Just at a different time. So note that the final time is different. It's because we need 2-hour blocks for finals. So the times have to be different for everyone. Nobody gets to move your final exam time around. So if another professor that you have changed the final time, I win because mine is at the time it's supposed to be. Okay? So we're not allowed to schedule our own finals. We're not allowed to change rooms or change times or anything like that. What else? Anything? Are we good? Okay, this week you guys are going to be doing urinary and reproductive and lab. You already did urinary in lecture, and we'll start on reproductive on Wednesday. Good. And there's probably something else. Oh, that thing. I haven't posted this, but will probably today. I'm going to reiterate for 3 percentage points on your 4th test, not very much. I don't want it to be too much. You can bring a donation for the Youth Homeless Shelter in Salt Lake City. What you would do is you would show me the donation that you're going to make, and I would just mark the 3 points for you, and then you would put it in the box. Apparently they moved the box to downstairs, which just means you have to haul it up here to show me, and then dump it in the box downstairs on your way out. Probably not too much. You are certainly not compelled to do that, and I don't need you to spend any money. It could be something used as long as it's gently used and new and clean for people, right? Like coats and that kind of stuff. Everybody cool about that? Okay. I feel like I'm forgetting to tell you something, but you're not telling me what it is, so I'm still going to forget it. Okay. All right. So you will have a quiz on Wednesday. I got to figure out what the hell's going on with the clicker program. But it will be over vessels and urinary. It's not going to be over lymphatic system, okay? So it should be the one you're already prepared for. Okay, so lymphatic system. I want to take the time to talk about lymphatic system because most people don't even know that they have one. So, and if you ever leave off a body system when they're teaching you anything, it's generally lymphatic system. And they're like, oh, and you have one of those too. So you do, you have one of those. And the lymphatic system has some functionality that you are definitely interested in, even though you don't know that you're interested in. What happens is, anatomically, the lymphatic system roughly has vessels that follow the course of your veins, okay? They are going to follow the course of your veins. They're super low pressure because they're not directly hooked up to the arterial end of the cardiovascular system. And what they are ultimately going to do is tissues, fluids leak out of your capillaries, right? Because capillaries are high pressure and porous. You guys with me? Now, some of that stuff that leaks out of your capillaries gets sucked back up by the capillaries just because of osmosis, right? If the blood becomes really, if it becomes really concentrated, it'll suck the fluid back in. But every time blood goes through a capillary bed, you lose around 10% of the fluid as it goes through. And you don't bring all of it back in via osmosis. So what about that last little bit that just keeps leaking out of the capillaries and not getting picked up by osmosis? Well, if you let that go on for very long, you would look like the Michelin Man, right? You would be building up so much fluid every time you went through a capillary bed that you would be enormous. So what happens is you're going to have to take that fluid, and let's say it's leaking out in the capillaries of your foot, and you're eventually going to have to make it all the way back up and get dumped back into your cardiovascular system. It gets dumped back in the subclavian veins, okay? But while you're working that fluid up, you're going to also have some immune system function that we'll talk about as we go through. So these are the lymph vessels. As you go through the lymph vessels, you are going to shunt it through these little way stations. And these little way stations will be lymph nodes. So we'll talk about those. There are some other parts of your lymphatic system. Your spleen is part of your lymphatic system. Your bone marrow is as well. You've got lymph nodes scattered around a few places. You've got the thymus gland, which is on top of your heart. And you've got tonsils. And then also some tissue that we call MALT, mucosa-associated lymphatic tissue. I'll come back to that one in a minute. It takes a minute to explain what it's all about. Okay, so the functions of the lymphatic system. It drains that excess fluid from tissue spaces, and it puts about 3 liters per day right back in your cardiovascular system. So you can see without a functional lymphatic system, you would gain 3 liters of fluid per day into your interstitial fluid, which means you would be losing more than half your blood volume. So thank you, lymphatic system, for helping me maintain my blood volume. Okay, so what happens if you can't drain that fluid back into the cardiovascular system? So have you guys ever heard that, for instance, when somebody has a mastectomy from breast cancer, quite often, for reasons that will become obvious in a minute, they will take the lymphatic vessels and lymph nodes as well in that area. Have you guys heard that? Okay. So if somebody has a mastectomy from breast cancer, one of the things that we'll see today, and it'll make sense to you, is that the lymphatic system is a really common route of metastasis for cancers. It's a really common way for cancers to get from point A to point B. So if you have a regional cancer, a lot of times they'll take the lymphatic tissue from that area. Now, does it make sense to you that if they did that, I might have a buildup of fluid in the arm that couldn't get back in, right? That's called lymphedema. And the lymphedema that occurs builds up fluid in the area. And a lot of times they will treat that with compression garments to help bring it back in, right? And sometimes lymphedema, you have no idea how it happened, right? You have no idea why you've got it. Sometimes they're like, oh, you had a surgery and somebody might have nicked a lymph node or something. So the lymphedema is this buildup of fluid, right? So that's lymphedema. If you want to see the worst lymphedema ever, you just have to look at elephantiasis. And elephantiasis is massive lymphedema because of a parasitic infection. So here's elephantiasis. Here's what happens. Carried by biting flies or mosquitoes, there are these parasites that will actually infect your lymphatic system. And they get transmitted from person to person via eggs in the bloodstream and the saliva of the critter that bites you. So if I was carrying it and it bit me and then bit you, it can be transmissible from person to person. The eggs aren't the problem. The problem is that the larva likes to grow inside your lymphatic vessels. And if it starts to grow inside your lymphatic vessels, can you see that as the larva gets bigger, it's going to cut off fluid flow, right? You're not going to be able to get the fluid back from where it goes. So in this particular instance, it looks like you had the larva encysting in the lymphatic vessels right around the knee, right? So you get this enormous buildup of fluid. This is called elephantiasis. Now, it's treatable. You treat it with basically a poison that poisons these little, they're filarial worms, these little worms out of your system. The poisons are really hard on the actual host, the person, because you have to get a eukaryotic multicellular parasite out of a eukaryotic multicellular host, right? Which means that you have to poison it out of your system. It's not like treating bacterial or viral pathogens. They're so very different that you can basically treat by attacking the difference between the two of them. But you're an animal and that's an animal. And so the treatment is really difficult on your system. It's really hard on your system. In addition, since the eggs are transmissible, I also need to not just treat one person in an area. I need to treat anyone who could have been infected in the area. Otherwise, you just transmit it again. Does that make sense? So that's one, elephantiasis. A lot of times it happens in the legs, wherever you got a lot of lymphatic vessels. Here's a couple other instances of elephantiasis. Here's another one. And then this one is elephantiasis of the testes. That is not a nice story, is it? There's also elephantiasis of the breast. This is in 1870. There was an entire village in which so many people got elephantiasis, and a lot of the men, for some reason, had elephantiasis of the testes. Their testes were so big that they could like sit on them. They like didn't need to bring anything to sit on. Just like got yourself a seat all the time. So, okay, so there is a relationship also with the lymphatic system to HIV and AIDS, which we will come to in just a minute. Okay, so it drains all that fluid back in, and then in addition, sometimes things that are not water leak out of the capillaries but can't get pulled back up by osmosis. Like if you pushed proteins out of the capillaries, you can't pull proteins back in by osmosis. Osmosis moves water, right? So now I've got proteins that leaked out and I need to get them back in. The only way to get them back in is to pull them back up in the lymphatic system and then dump them that way. In addition, your lymphatic system is actually how you absorb fats. After Thanksgiving dinner, when you were absorbing the proteins and the sugars, you absorb them from your digestive tract into your blood capillaries, okay? But fats don't go into the blood capillaries. They go into these lymphatic capillaries. So you absorb those directly into your lymphatic system. Fascinatingly, right after you eat a really fatty meal, your lymph, as it starts moving up, is like opaque because it's got so many fat globules in it. Isn't that gross? Like after Thanksgiving, it's all opaque, like gravy when it cools down. And then you move it up and give yourself about 30 minutes, and then it will dump into your cardiovascular system, and then your blood will become slightly opaque. Pretty gross. And it's all sticking to the sides of your blood vessels. Okay, so the other thing about that is that fats, because they're absorbed not into the cardiovascular system, but they're absorbed into the lymphatic system, they escape the hepatic portal system. And that means that lipid-soluble toxins are more potentially toxic, right, than water-soluble ones, because they escape the first pass through the hepatic portal system. I mean, eventually they're going to go through it, right, because eventually you're going to go through the whole damn thing. So they escape the hepatic portal system, and then in addition, the kidney has a really hard time getting rid of lipid-soluble toxins. So if you got something lipid-soluble, it's good to make sure it's pretty damn healthy for you, because there's not a whole hell of a lot you can do with it. Okay, and then this is where I want to talk to you. I'm going to do like an overview of the lymphatic system and immunity and defense. Now, I don't usually test very hard on this. The reason I'm going to tell you this at all is because you are a human and you need to be able to understand this stuff so that people don't have the capacity to BS you. So I'm going to teach you about the relationship of the lymphatic system and the immune and defense system so that the next time somebody tells you not to vaccinate your children, you can ask them to explain this to you, and if they can't, don't listen to them, okay? So here we go. You ready? So the lymphatic system has these cells in it. And the biggest category of cells that are found in the lymphatic system are a category of white blood cells called lymphocytes. And that should make sense to you. Lymphocytes, lymphatic system. It's not the only kind of cells that they have in there, but the lymphocytes are in the lymphatic system. Now, of course, all white blood cells and red blood cells and platelets for that matter were made in the bone marrow. Yes? Okay. But what happens with these is they start to circulate and live in the lymphatic system more than in other places. I'm not saying they're limited to there, but they live in the lymphatic system disproportionately. And you have two categories that are going to be really important for this story. You have B lymphocytes. B lymphocytes mature in the bone marrow. That's why they're called B lymphocytes. You with me? T lymphocytes mature in this gland sitting over the heart called the thymus, and that's why they're called T lymphocytes. Okay? And they're both going to be an important part of this story. So here's what I want to tell you. Your immune system and defense. So first let's define defense and immunity. Defense is what happens when somebody comes up and clocks you just out of the blue. You are going to defend yourself, correct? Okay. Immunity is what happens when you learn that dude's weakness and you are ready for him the next time and he doesn't even land the swing. Does that make sense? Okay. So your lymphatic system is involved in defense, but even more important, it's intimately involved in immunity. So it is the smart, remembering slights portion of your immune system. Does that make sense? So it's going to remember exposures so that the next time they might not land the punch, okay? So let's look at how it does that. So what happens is the lymphatic system, and specifically the B cells and T cells, by the way, they're sometimes just called B cells and T cells, they help to develop what we call specific immunity, learning about the thing that just attacked you so that the next time you won't go down. That's what's happening here. Okay, so let me teach you this story, okay? You ready? This is the story I'm going to tell you. Okay, here's a T lymphocyte and here's a B lymphocyte. Don't worry too much about the details of the figure. It's just so that I can have a visual to show you the story. I don't usually test very hard on this at all. Okay, so here's what happens. I want you to imagine that I go somewhere I've never been and meet a pathogen that I've never met, okay, right? So for instance, I have never been exposed to malaria, but if I go to Southeast Asia, the probability of me getting exposed to malaria increases, correct? Okay, so I'm going to go to Southeast Asia and I'm going to get exposed to malaria. This is the first time I've ever met a pathogen, okay, that particular pathogen. Here's what happens when I meet that pathogen. Okay, first off, how do I know it's a pathogen? How do I know it's something new? I don't know if you guys remember, you should, from 1610, the concept of all of our cells having identifying antigens on their surface. Okay, you with it? Okay, so I always think of the antigen as a flag. Okay, it is a little protein sugar flag that's on the surface of a cell, and my antigen says human, and then it also says Melanie, right? It's like specific to me, okay? That means that when my immune system sees something go by with that flag, it's like, that's cool, that's fine, that's us, right? But what happens if an E. coli gets into my system? It also has a flag, yes? But it's not my flag. Does that make sense? So what happens when any kind of pathogen gets into my system is it's got a different flag, a different antigen, and the difference is what makes my immune system kick into action. So what I want to do is I want to expose myself to a flag I've never met before and watch how this first exposure goes. You ready? Okay, so the flag is called an antigen. Okay, that's the flag. I'll talk about how you get exposed to it in just a second. And then what happens with these B lymphocytes is the B lymphocytes, when they are exposed to the antigen in exactly the perfect way, what happens is the B lymphocyte will start to launch an attack and then tell people about it for the future. So here's how you launch an attack. The B lymphocyte, when it's exposed to a specific flag, this is malaria, right? Starts to go through cell division, okay? And it makes these cells that make little heat-seeking missiles specifically for the malaria antigen. These are called antibodies. Everybody okay with that? They're little proteins that go into your bloodstream and they will go look for and whoop up on anything that has the malaria flag on it, okay? They will let everything else go by. They don't care about anything else. So this is specific immunity. Does that make sense? Okay, but this is still just defense. Where does the immunity come in? Okay, the immunity comes in because every time you go through cell division, you make another one of these that is now for the rest of its history and its future committed to only malaria. Okay, so this one is going to go through cell division and there will be more of them the next time it goes through cell division. And then this one's going to go to cell division. Do you see that there are more of them? Okay. So every single time you're going through cell division, what you're doing is you're making attackers, those are the antibodies, and memory cells. So now, fast forward 2 years and I go back to Southeast Asia, yeah? And I get exposed to malaria. Do I necessarily go down when I get exposed to malaria? No, because I was ready for it, right? I was completely ready for it with all of those memory B cells that could do this process way faster the second time or the third time or the fifth time, right? So why can you now get exposed to chickenpox without getting chickenpox? Because either you've had it before or you've been vaccinated. So now let's talk about this story with reference to vaccinations, okay? How does this story have any relevance to vaccinations? Well, it is phenomenal because once they actually figured out the biochemistry and cell biology of this process, they figured out that, oh, you could actually start this whole memory process without getting clocked in the face, right? You could learn about your enemy without getting clocked in the face. So what happens now is that chickenpox vaccines didn't exist when I was a kid. They didn't have that one. So the way that you get exposed to chickenpox and the way that I got exposed to chickenpox are different. So these guys, in all likelihood, what happened is you got a vaccine for chickenpox. Here's what you did. You didn't give the kid living chickenpox because that would make them get chickenpox. What you did is you gave them the antigen, the flag, that would elicit the response. You either gave it on a killed organism, the organism was not alive and therefore could not go through cell division, or you gave just the antigen without the organism. Does that make sense? And then what happens is you go through this process and you end up with a whole bunch of memory cells and a whole bunch of antibodies so that when you did get exposed to chickenpox, you didn't go down. Does that make sense? Okay, so this is how the whole process is related to vaccinations. This is the reason that you didn't get polio, because polio was almost eradicated by an effective worldwide vaccination campaign. The polio story is actually pretty fascinating. I don't know if you've ever heard of this one. So Jonas Salk came up with the polio vaccine, and he was pretty darn sure that it would work, but he didn't have anybody to experiment on. So do you know what he did? He infected himself. Yep. And then once he figured out it worked, unlike the dude who decided to up the cost of HIV medication 750%, Jonas Salk, after he figured out the polio vaccine, gave it free. Gave the process free to the entire world to eliminate polio, which was pretty damn effective. There's only a couple of little pockets of polio left in the world. But they do think that with this sort of anti-vaccination movement that these diseases that were almost completely eradicated will now start popping up again. And polio causes death, paralysis, brain damage, spinal cord damage, those kinds of things. So that's the relationship to vaccination. So now let's back up a little bit and put the T cells into this because we didn't talk about what the T cells do with this. This is all B cell stuff. So The T cells are actually a phenomenally important part of this, because what the T cells, or the T lymphocytes, do is this T cell right here, the T cell will not, the B cell will not work without a command from the T cell. So the way that you think about the T cell is it's the general of your entire immune system military, okay? So what happens is the B cells will do all of this, but only when given the command directly from a T cell. So here's what happens. Okay, so let's go back up a little bit and build this guy. Ready? So how do the T cells get to command the immune system? So, well, the T cell is the one that has to meet the foreign cell with the antigen. So the T cell has to come into contact with that malaria pathogen, okay? And here's what it does. In the process of whooping up on that malaria pathogen, it will whoop up on it, and then it will take the flag. And it will say, I know who the enemy is, okay? And then the general will say, this is who you're looking for, B cell. And the B cell, when it hears the command from the T cell, will launch that immune system response. Does that make sense? If it hears it from any other source, it doesn't trust it. So that means if you had never been commanded to recognize malaria, then what would happen is all the malaria in the world could go straight by you, and you wouldn't even bat an eye, right? So the T cell actually is going to go through mitosis, and it's going to ultimately stimulate that B cell, right? But in addition, it also stimulates macrophages, big old lumbering, like meatheads of the immune system. And then it also causes cytotoxic T cells, which will actually do apoptosis on any foreign antigen. So it directs 3 different parts of the immune system. Now, back to HIV and AIDS. The tragedy of HIV and AIDS is that HIV and AIDS infects and takes out the generals. Do you see how that will trash your entire immune system? Yeah? So HIV and AIDS takes these guys out, which means that when you have HIV, as your T cell count starts to fall, then you are susceptible to opportunistic pathogens that most of us wouldn't get. You get freaking bird flu and die. You get a type of cancer that most people would have caught with their immune system, right? You get opportunistic infections, you get tuberculosis, you get all kinds of things because you took out the generals of your immune system. That make sense? Okay, because it takes out these. What happens is the HIV, it's a retrovirus. It actually injects its DNA, and then whenever the T cell goes through cell division, it makes more virus, and it tends to take out your T cells over time. Okay, everybody good? Okay, so that's my general policy when somebody's anti-vaccine, is I ask them to explain this to me, and if they can't, they should shut up. Okay. And little Susie, who's been homeschooling her kids for 2 years and is anti-vaccine, generally can't do this, right? Right? Okay? So, not that they're not right, but if you can't explain your position well enough to convince me, then I'm done talking to you. Okay, so specific immunity, which is what we were just talking about, becomes more effective at fighting off pathogens with each exposure, interestingly. Unlike non-specific defenses, your non-specific defenses don't get any smarter. They just get clocked in the face every single time, but these get better with each exposure. Okay, so now let's back up and do the anatomy again. Okay, so the lymphatic system anatomy. So your lymphatic system components, some of them you will understand. The fluid, as it makes it into the vessels, is called lymph. These are called lymphatic vessels. These little way stations along the lymphatic vessels are the site at which you have a whole bunch of those B cells and T cells and macrophages. Those are called lymph nodes, and they're variable in people. And then the other things that are part of it are the spleen, the thymus, where the T cells mature, the tonsils, which are just big chunks that have a whole bunch of those lymphocytes in them, and then MALT, mucosa-associated lymphatic tissue. Okay, let me make the concept of MALT make sense to you. Does it make sense that you would probably want a whole bunch of B cells and T cells and macrophages immediately deep to all of your mucous membranes? Respiratory, digestive, urogenital. Yeah? When you put a whole chunk of that stuff immediately under a mucous membrane, it's called MALT, mucosa-associated lymphatic tissue. Yeah? Because that's where you're going to get exposed to pathogens, is at your mucous membranes, right? So you got big chunks of it immediately in the back of your throat and in the back of your nasopharynx and oropharynx. Those are called tonsils. They're just big chunks of MALT. Then you've got a bunch of it along your bronchi and along your digestive tract, lining the urethra just behind it, lining the vagina, all of those locations. Does that make sense? So that's what MALT is. MALT is hard to picture, but it's easy to understand why you need it. Okay, so what is lymph like? Lymph is basically blood plasma without the clotting proteins. It's pretty much what it's like. It gets pushed out. Contains less protein than blood plasma. Contains no red blood cells, no platelets. It does have leukocytes, but it shouldn't have red blood cells or platelets in it. Okay, so let's talk about how you get the fluid into the lymphatic vessels. Okay, so capillaries. You guys have met capillaries before. This is a systemic capillary. This is the arterial end, and this is the venous end. Okay. Now, what you haven't seen, because of course capillaries are microscopic, is that in addition to the blood-containing portion of the capillary, there are also these blind end lymph capillaries. And the blind end lymph capillaries are not directly connected to this system. But what they are is if you open up one of them, you will see that they're microscopic, thin-walled, and have one-way valves, which will allow you to let any kind of anything in, like fluids, big proteins, even whole cells. Now this becomes really important because the lymphatic system is the most common route of metastasis for cancer because of this. So let's talk about like a cancer occurring in any region. When the cancer occurs in any region, one of the characteristics of cancer cells versus other cells is that the cancer cells have a tendency to release themselves from the tissues that they came in with, right? So it's not like a skin cancer just goes through cell division and stays in the skin. They actually release themselves, right? So they become mobilized. When they become mobilized, they go into the interstitial fluid, right? Okay, and then what happens with the lymphatic system? It pulls them up. And what does it do? If I had a cancer that occurred in my toe, now it goes from here to here, from here to here, from here to here, from here to here, into my bloodstream ultimately. Do you see? Incredibly common route for metastasis in cancer. Now, it's possible that you could have caught them at any of these locations, and in all likelihood, you probably caught 98% of them. But if your immune system didn't catch all of them, then as soon as that cell makes it to a place where it sits and starts dividing again, then you have a metastatic cancer, right? Then you have a strange situation in which you need to be a histologist or a pathologist to tell that this cancer that is in my brain actually originated in my bone marrow. And how the hell can I tell? I can tell because it is a bone marrow cell that is actually growing in my brain tissue. The most common route for it to get from one place to the other is the lymphatic system. Go ahead.
So why is it different from other diseases where the B cells and the T cells can fight those off but not the cancer?
Well, that's an interesting question. I want you to think about cancer cells. What kind of antigen would they have on their surface? They would have your own antigens on the surface. So they are not actually a pathogen. They're a different kind of lymphatic cell called a cytotoxic T cell that takes care of most cancer cells, but it's not actually like under the purview of the B cells. Antibodies don't generally take out cancer cells because they're yours, right? They're just like misbehaving U cells is all they are. It's one of the reasons it's a little harder to catch them. Does that make sense to you? That's a good question. Okay, so you guys understand how the lymphatic system can be related to metastasis of cancer? Okay, so these blind end lymphatic capillaries begin in capillaries almost everywhere. You don't have them in the capillaries of your central nervous system. That doesn't mean that you can't get stuff to the central nervous system. It means that you don't usually pick up brain cancers and make them metastasize to other things via the lymphatic system. You can still do it via cerebrospinal fluid and blood, but lymphatic system is not the most common route. You also don't have these in your bone marrow, but the bone marrow dumps directly into the bloodstream anyway. You don't have them in bone and you don't have them in teeth, but in almost every other place you have these lymphatic capillaries. So they're similar to blood capillaries, but they don't have tight junctions because they don't really need to be tight. They're supposed to pick up everything. And the special lymphatic capillaries that you have behind the digestive tract are called Tcells, and those are the ones that absorb fat from your digestive system. Okay, now, when they get big enough so that you can see them, they're not called capillaries anymore, they're called lymphatic vessels. Now, they are so variable from person to person that you really don't learn the names of any of them except for the two largest ones. Okay, we'll talk about those in just a second. But here's what I want you to understand, okay? So, tell this whole story about like activating your immune system and stuff, and I want you to imagine that I stepped on something and got infected with a pathogen on my foot, okay? And now I've got a pathogen, so it's got an antigen in it that I should elicit an immune response to. Here's what happens. I step on it, it gets an infection in my foot, and then the capillaries, right, the lymphatic capillaries will suck that stuff up, yes? And then as it sucks it up, it's going to send it through a lymph node, and the lymph node is a big collection of B cells, T cells, and macrophages. So as it goes into the lymph node, then the B cells and T cells and macrophages will hopefully whoop up on it and launch an immune system response. So when the fluid comes back out of the lymph node, it should be different than the fluid that went in, right? But just to make sure, this is a completely redundant process because it doesn't go through one lymph node, it goes through this one, then it goes through another one, and another one, and another one, and another one, and another one. Hopefully by the time you dump that fluid back into the subclavian veins, I have killed whatever was in there, and I have let the rest of the body know what happened, right? That makes sense? I've activated an immune system response. And the series of lymph nodes that you go through is the redundancy of the system, right? Pretty damn effective because we're not sick as often as we certainly could be with all the pathogens in the world. Go ahead.
If there's one-way valves, then how does the fluid get back out?
I'll tell you in just a minute. Okay, so these resemble veins in structure, but now let's look at them in more detail. So let's take one of these vessels and look at it, okay? Do you see this one? So we're gonna have pressure issues in lymphatic vessels, right? Because they don't have a pump hooked up to them, yes? And in addition, most of them are moving against gravity, not all of them, but most of them are moving against gravity. So how do we account for the pressure problems? Well, first off, they have tons of valves in them. Way, way more than veins do. So they're super low pressure. And then in addition, they are also, what motivates fluid to go through them is your skeletal muscle contraction. So when you use your skeletal muscle, it pushes on the vessels, but the fluid can't go backwards, so it has to go back up. So skeletal muscle contraction, the same concept with veins, the skeletal muscle pump and the respiratory pump, right? So with the ones here, the respiratory system, if you can get it up to here, the respiratory system will help with changing the pressure and get it back up, okay? So these are your lymphatic vessels, and ultimately, the lymphatic vessels are going to generally follow the path of veins back toward the heart. They're going to dump into the subclavian veins, and they have this weird, weird drainage pattern. I don't know how the hell this evolved. Maybe you guys can figure it out. The drainage pattern, so all of these, okay, are going to end up dumping ultimately into the right and the left subclavian veins. But they dump in this really weird pattern. So here's the pattern. The entire left side of the body, okay, and everything on the right side below about the ribs gets dumped into the left subclavian vein. And then with the right one, it's only the upper right portion of the body, the right side of the head, right side of the chest, right arm, okay? So this is how this works. So do you see this big honking vessel right here? This is where a whole bunch of the lymphatic system comes together, and it comes into this big cavern right there called the cisterna chyli. And if you watch this one, it's going to end up dumping up into here, into the left subclavian vein. And that drains the entire lower body and the left side, okay, including the left side of the head. So that drains into here. So that this guy right here is called the thoracic duct. Okay, dumps into the left subclavian vein. And then this little bitty guy right here dumps into the right subclavian vein, and that's the right lymphatic duct, and it only does that right part. I have no idea how that evolved. It's a weird drainage pattern. But ultimately, they're all going to end up there. Okay, so thoracic duct and right lymphatic duct. And like I said, the flow of lymph is not due to blood pressure. It's due to the skeletal muscle pump and the respiratory pump. Okay, last thing to do today is just to put this into the context, to put all of this anatomy together with the B cells and T cells stuff that we talked about. Okay, so the basic unit of all lymphatic tissue is a little collection of B cells and T cells called a lymphatic nodule or lymph follicle. I want to show it to you a couple of different times so that you can start to recognize it. Do you see this light center and dark edge? Do you see that? Okay, B cells are light, T cells are dark. At the middle, you're going to have B cells and macrophages, and at the outside, you're going to have T cells. Do you see a similar arrangement right here? Light, dark? Okay. How about right here in a lymph node? Do you see light, dark? Do you see that? Okay. And here is an actual histology slide of a lymph node. And then here is the spleen. Light, dark. Do you see it? Okay. So, and then last but not least, this is the thymus. So here's the deal. The way that you make lymphatic tissue is to arrange those little lymph nodules in a bunch of different places. You can just stick them as a lymph nodule below the mucous membrane, and then that's malt. Or you can wrap them in connective tissue and make a little bean out of them, and then that's a lymph node. You can make a big fleshy organ out of them, and then that is the spleen, right? But regardless, they're all made of this sort of repeating units of these lymph follicles or lymphatic nodules. That makes sense? Okay, so let's just look at what one is made of. Okay, so one of them, basically, actually let's look at it on here on a lymph node. No, let's look at it here. Okay, so what's going to happen is the B cells and macrophages will be at the middle, and the T cells are going to be at the edge. So no matter where they are. So I want you to just sort of briefly start to understand how a lymph node works. So imagine that this lymph node was in my neck. So the fluid is going from here down, okay? And so what happens is as the fluid goes in, right, it got sucked up from the interstitial fluid, right? As the fluid goes in, I am going to shunt that fluid by all of these B cells and T cells. And as I'm doing that, if I run into a pathogen, I can start the immune system response. Does that make sense? And then as it goes by, it's going to end up making it out. So these are called afferent lymph vessels, right? And then this one's going to be an efferent lymph vessel, yeah? And as I make it out, this fluid in all likelihood will be different than the fluid that went in. It'll have more antibodies, it'll have fewer pathogens that are alive in it, right? That makes sense? And then if I didn't catch it that time, I can send it through another lymph node on my way back in, okay? And all because I'm running them by these B cells and T cells that can actually elicit an immune response as you go by, okay? So last thing is just to sort of tell you about the redundancy of the system, and then we'll pick this up next time because the last class started late because I couldn't get the clicker program working. Okay, so why so much redundancy? There's so many different ways that you can get exposed to pathogens. So here's the deal. If I got exposed to a respiratory pathogen, I could launch the immune system response in my tonsils, right? Or I could launch it in the malt that was just under my respiratory system. Or what if it bypassed those and actually got out into the tissue fluid? Well, then I would dump it into the lymphatic system, right? Dump it into the fluid and launch the immune system response as it goes through a lymph node, right? Okay, but are these going to compete with one another? No, all they're doing is like you get exposed to the pathogen at multiple fronts, and then you launch a collective immune system response. Well, what if I actually breathe something in that I also swallowed? Well, then I'd launch an immune system response in the malt in my digestive tract. But it's all a response that can help globally with exposure to a pathogen, right? And then the last thing that we will see is the spleen actually monitors the blood, not the lymph. The spleen monitors the blood for pathogens. So what if I didn't catch it in the respiratory system and didn't catch it in the lymph and didn't catch it anywhere else? If I dump it alive into my bloodstream, then it goes through my spleen, and then my spleen launches an immune system response to it. Right? So it's just all of this redundancy, this sort of layered immune system response, which is the reason you're still alive, honestly. That makes sense? Okay, we'll stop there for today.